When you fall silent before God, is it emptiness or completion? You may believe that silence means withdrawal, the pause before meaning returns. But Ibn Arabi saw it differently. He taught that silence is not the absence of expression. It is expression in its purest form. Words may point toward truth, but silence stands within it. You often speak to understand. You explain to yourself what you already think you know. Yet each word divides, naming what cannot be divided. Ibn Arabi challenged this habit. He asked whether speech truly reveals what you mean or conceals it beneath thought. If silence contains no words, then what kind of knowing does it hold? Ibn Arabi lived in 12th century Andalusia, an age filled with theological debate and mystical inquiry. He was called Al-Sheikh Al-Akbar, the Great Master, because his vision united philosophy, revelation, and direct experience. For him, language was only a surface phenomenon. Beneath every utterance lay what he called the speech of reality, a communication that needs no sound. His writings turn from outer practice to the inner act of knowing, an awareness that observes thought without becoming trapped by it. Thus, Ibn Arabi's silence was not the silence of avoidance, but the refinement of perception until only the real could speak. You think that speech clarifies what is hidden, but each word is also a border. It captures one part of the infinite and calls it complete. Ibn Arabi warned that this creates a subtle illusion. Once a truth is expressed, it becomes a thought, and thought belongs to the mind, not to reality. In this way, the symbol replaces what it was meant to reveal. You can describe love, but not be that description. You can speak of God, but not enclose him in speech. The mind, when it names, separates. It turns unity into ideas. The more it defines, the more it loses the unspoken wholeness from which it began. Can thought ever speak without dividing what it seeks? For Ibn Arabi, silence was not a gap between thoughts. It was a mode of direct knowing. He called it mrifa, a knowledge that arises without mediation. This knowledge cannot be obtained by analysis or belief. It occurs when awareness rests in itself, free from judgment. The real discloses itself. When the mind stops trying to disclose it, to be silent in this sense is not to refuse language, but to see through it. Words become transparent. They are no longer obscure. Silence is not ignorance. It is the surrender of the need to know conceptually. But then, if silence knows, who or what is the knower? You listen even when no one speaks. This listening does not belong to the ears. It is awareness itself, open, unmoving, without preference. Ibn Arabi called this the eye of the heart. It listens to thought, emotion, and sensation without commentary. Within such listening, there is no interpreter. What is heard and what is heard are no longer two. To listen truly is to stop trying to listen. Effort distorts. Intention interrupts. But when attention becomes still, understanding happens on its own. In that inner stillness, the question arises, who is listening? The answer cannot be found in sound or silence, because both are contained within the one who perceives them. According to Ibn Arabi, silence is not the end of God's speech, but its highest form. Every created thing is a divine utterance, yet the source from which they emerge remains soundless. He wrote that God speaks continuously, not in language, but in being. The world itself is his ongoing address. Silence is simply the awareness of that unbroken communication. Thus, when you become silent, you do not stop the conversation. You step out of interference. The divine continues to speak, but through still awareness, rather than articulated thought. What we call silence is not a human condition. It is God's own speech, heard when the self no longer insists on replying. Ibn Arabi's silence was not passive. It was disciplined restraint. To speak about what cannot be fully known is to risk reducing it to concept. Therefore, silence becomes an ethical act, a form of humility before reality. He advised that restraint is not suppression, but purification. When the urge to assert diminishes, the mind becomes receptive. Understanding arises without claim. The truest silence does not deny reality. It refuses to distort it. To remain unopinionated before the infinite is not weakness. It is integrity. Could it be that silence rather than speech is the most honest acknowledgement of truth? You begin to notice that silence and speech both appear within the same awareness. Neither is higher nor lower. Both are movements of one reality. Ibn Arabi described this as the unity of opposites, the realization that even dualities exist only within the single field of being. When this is seen clearly, silence is no longer an act of choice. It is a natural recognition of how things are. You do not become silent. Silence becomes you. Speech arises and falls within it like thought within mind. Then a deeper insight forms. If all opposites share one ground, what remains to be called silence at all? At first, you tried to practice silence as a method. You measured it, guarded it, disciplined yourself to maintain it. But gradually, silence began to act through you. Ibn Arabi said that when silence matures, the seeker dissolves. There is no longer one who practices. What remains is being itself, unfragmented and unowed. Silence is no longer something done. It is what you are before thought begins. The effort to reach God fades because the distance was imagined. The human search concludes not in discovery, but in disappearance. What meaning can seeking have when the seeker no longer stands apart from what is sought? In the end, silence is not a practice, but the recognition of reality as it is. Words and thoughts continue, but they no longer claim authority. They move lightly, without attachment. Ibn Arabi's hidden practice was to let this recognition penetrate every act. Speech, when it arises, flows from the same stillness that once seemed silent. Action, too, becomes transparent, free of possession. Silence now reveals itself as sufficiency, the fullness that needs nothing added, the truth that stands complete without explanation. You rest in understanding, not because questions have been answered, but because questioning itself has become unnecessary. Nothing more needs to be said, because nothing has ever been withheld. The inquiry began with doubt. Is silence absence or presence? Through Ibn Arabi's insight, you discover that silence is not the negation of meaning, but its origin. Speech divides. Silence unites. Expression is useful, but it veils the real behind form. Gradually, you move from defining silence to recognizing it as your own awareness, the condition in which both sound and thought appear. The seeker disappears, and the mind grows still. The silence that once seemed human becomes divine. It no longer speaks to God. It speaks as God, the timeless voice heard when nothing interrupts what simply is.